Mohammed Salah's 20-year saga of political persecution, which began in January of 1993 with his arrest at the Eretz checkpoint by the IDF, and practically ended at the end of this last year after he was delisted from designated as a special terrorist after 17 years on that list, and probably one of the only U.S. citizens ever so designated, dramatically exposes the politically motivated use of terrorism charges by the Israeli government and the U.S. government to repress Palestinians in the U.S. supporting their people living under occupation in Palestine. And obviously, in the 10 minutes or 12 minutes I have, I cannot tell you this whole history of how this U.S. government and the Israeli government collaborated, cooperated, conspired with the pro-Israeli lobby in the U.S. against Mohammed Salah. I'm going to give you a general overview, and then obviously you have access to the article that we wrote, which really lays it out in a very detailed way. Mohammed Salah was a naturalized citizen, beloved member of the Palestinian community in the Chicago area, active in his mosque, owner of a small grocery store, and was asked to help facilitate the bringing of financial aid to people living under occupation. It was at the time of the Intifada, and was also following the forced deportation of 450 men to the no man's land in Lebanon without hearing, who were accused of being leaders of Hamas in 1992. This act was condemned unanimously by the Security Council of the United Nations. I said unanimously. The United States supported that, and they called for the immediate return of those men who were ripped from their families, who were very active in the social welfare networks that Hamas was very active in setting up at that time. And this occasioned Mohammed Salah to go to the West Bank and Gaza to help those people who were the families of those people and others. He was arrested by the IDF. He was taken to the Ramallah interrogation center. He was subjected to traditional torture by the GSS or the Shin Bet. He was put under severe sensory deprivation, kept in isolation, sleep deprived for 8 days, on and off. He was hit and threatened. He said he was told the FBI would arrest his family in the U.S. We work with the FBI, they'll do what we want. And he was denied access to a lawyer or even to the U.S. consul for 10 days. And within the first 2 days, the Israeli government had leaked to the Israeli press that they had captured a world leader, a military leader of Hamas. This was a grocer that hadn't been to the West Bank in 20 years, who was a U.S. citizen, and they said that he was a world military leader of Hamas. And after that, every day there would be more information about how he was sending money to rebuild Hamas's military structure, and how there were leaders of Hamas in the United States who were directing him and others in the military activity of Hamas. By the way, at that particular time, Hamas had not committed any suicide bombings. They had attacked some military outposts, but there was nothing. They were not on any list as a terrorist organization. And what was going on was the U.S., Israel was pressuring the U.S. for months to stop money coming from Palestinians in the U.S. to the occupied territories. They wanted to arrest who they claimed were leaders of Hamas who were living in the U.S. And the U.S. was having none of it at that particular time. So they needed a dramatic occasion to show the U.S. that this is what was going on, that this man was part of the leadership of Hamas who was involved in funding the military activities. The U.S. was not buying it. The FBI was not buying it. The U.S. government was not buying it. The U.S. consul was continually saying, we believe this man is being tortured. We want to see him. Why aren't we getting access to him? And this went on essentially for 50 days. And in those 50 days, the only thing that the Israeli government could show for their interrogation were 3 statements in Hebrew that were taken by an Israeli police officer, and Mohammed Salah did not read, write, or understand Hebrew. So at one point, they were so desperate to convince the U.S. that this was the leader of a terrorist organization that Yitzhak Rabin asked his personal friend Judith Miller, who was a New York Times reporter, to come to the secret interrogation center where no one is allowed, not the Red Cross, not the police, and let her observe one 30-minute interrogation session with Mohammed Salah, which was in Arabic, and she doesn't speak Arabic, and she had some GSS flunky translating while she looked at the interrogation for 30 minutes. And then she wrote a series of articles for the New York Times saying, oh, he didn't look like he was being tortured, he looked like he was very cooperative, and in fact, he believed the Israelis are saying he's a military commander and the military is being run out of the United States. And it still didn't convince the FBI, and they still weren't willing to do anything. And then the Israelis took out their last arsenal in this interrogation. They sent him to what's called the birds. This is after 50 days of interrogation, nonstop. The birds are Palestinian arrested people who are now cooperating with the Israelis, and they get money or other privileges by working for them. And they put Mohammed Salah in a cell with 20 of them. And there's no supervision or no monitoring of it, no video monitoring, no audio monitoring. And after 2 weeks, and he's disappeared. No one knows where he is. His lawyer doesn't know where he is. And after 2 weeks, working with the Shin Bet on a daily basis, bringing in information, getting information from the FBI, they worked with Mohammed Salah, and he wrote a 50-page statement in his own handwriting at the bribing and the punishment and the assault and the threats of these birds, and essentially said, yes, I was bringing money to fund the military, and I work with all these organizations in the U.S., and named all these organizations and all these people, the Holy Land and all these other ones. And they had that. Now they had what they needed. They went to the U.S., they convinced the U.S., the U.S. consul stopped complaining about torture. And the next thing you know, Mohammed Salah had no choice but go to a military trial and face life imprisonment or make a deal. And he made a deal. He got 5 years in prison for being a military commander of Hamas and was released a year early. 4 years he did in prison because the Israelis had what they wanted at that time and they didn't need him anymore. So they let him go. While he was in prison, he was put on a list by the U.S. government, a special designated terrorist, which meant that he couldn't receive money or give money, he couldn't pay a doctor, he couldn't work. Every time he went to the grocery store or to the movies, he needed a license by the Treasury Department to spend money. And he's been on that list, he was on that list for 17 years. So he returned to the U.S., he was met by his family at the airport, and among the people that met him was an informant working for the FBI, who had worked in the past for the Israelis and had a long history of spying on Palestinians. And this guy got next to him, and there was a grand jury investigation. They were going to indict all these people for money laundering and terrorism. And then the Clinton administration said, we're not going to do this, and dropped it. Dropped the whole investigation. All the things the informant was telling him they thought was unreliable. They got rid of the informant, and it looked like Mohammed's tragedy was over. And then 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, they brought the informant back who had been discredited, and they reconvened the grand jury, and they indicted Mohammed Salah for RICO racketeering, influence, corrupt organization. They said Hamas was a racketeering organization and that he was part of that Hamas, and what they based that on was his confession, that was that 50-page confession and 5 hours of tapes in which after the confession, the good GSS, good guy cop, secretly taped him going through what he wrote down on his written confession. So now they had a big press conference. Ashcroft and Mueller and Pat, the U.S. Attorney, whose name escapes me right now.
Charities.
Thank you, sir. And they indicted him for material support because they claimed that he was telling the informant that they were going to go and scout some scenes in Israel for bombing. Here was a guy that didn't even know where to go there, and he was going to scout some scenes. And so we had a situation now where we were going to have a trial in federal court in Chicago. But the government had a problem because they had to put in a statement, right? And in order to put in a statement, they have to show that it was voluntary, it wasn't coerced. Now, how were they going to do that? They came to us and said, well, we're going to do you a favor. We've worked with the Israelis, and they've agreed to allow two of the 12 interrogators to come to the U.S. But there's certain conditions that we're going to have to abide by, or else they won't come. And what were they? That, first of all, the courtroom would be closed. No press, no public, no family. They actually put black drapes over the windows of the courtroom. Secondly, these interrogators would come and use code names. We wouldn't know their real names, so we couldn't find out what their backgrounds or what they did. They would also wear light disguises, whatever that may mean. And all the reports and all the protocol and all the policies of what the Shin Bet uses, that was given to us, the U.S. Attorney says, but it's all classified information. Because once the Israelis say the information's classified, it's automatically classified by us. So you can't see any of their policies, their programs, their protocols. Even the Israeli Supreme Court did a whole exposure of what policies the Shin Bet uses and what they can use, moderate force, they can sleep deprivation, none of that, that's all secret. So what are we going to do? We're saying we want all of it. We can't agree to this. So too bad the judge is going to go along with it, which she did, of course. And the first day of the suppression hearing, the courtroom's clear, just the U.S. Attorney and defense lawyers are there, and Mohammed Salah, not his wife, who's been at his side for all these years. And the back of the courtroom opens up, and 7 Israelis walk in. 4 attorneys and 3 security people. What's their names? They can't tell you their names. They fill the courtroom. They bring on the first guy whose code name is Nadav, and 150 times during cross-examination they say the information's classified. We can't ask it. And each time the Israeli lawyers and the U.S. Attorney and the judge go in the back room and confer. We're not there, we're not part of it. It's ex parte, we're sitting there, and each time the judge says, well, I've heard from the witness, and I've heard from the Israelis, and I heard from the U.S. Attorney, and I'm not going to let you ask those questions, and I'm not going to give you that information, and go ahead, continue your cross-examination. So basically, this went on for 2 weeks, and even despite that, we brought in experts from Israeli experts on torture and the role of the Shin Bet, Palestinian experts, the founder of El Haq, Dr. El Sarraj, who talks about how the effects of isolation on coercive interrogation. He's the head of the Gaza Mental Health Clinic, and made a very strong case, and even found other Palestinians who had been tortured by the very people that are now in the courtroom saying, oh, we don't torture people. No. He very voluntarily gave up the information. The judge denied our motion, said the confession was voluntary, get on with your trial. And but the problem was that we had a jury coming in. And they couldn't say all this is classified in front of the jury because it would show the jury they were hiding stuff. So what they do under this law, this Classified Information Protection Act, is they give you what's called stipulations or substitutions for what information they're keeping secret. And because we complained so much and because the courtroom was filled every day with people from the Palestinian community and their supporters, they would line up at 7 in the morning and the judge would see that and understand that this was somebody that had support of his community. They gave us these stipulations which said basically that the Shin Bet is allowed to deprive people of sleep. They're allowed to tie people to small chairs and stress positions. They're allowed to use moderate force against them. And they're allowed to use birds, which are people who are Palestinians who are given privileges for working with them. And what they do is not monitored in any way. And we were able, during the cross-examination of these Shin Bet interrogators, they switched them and they brought another new guy because they didn't like the first guy. We were able to turn to the jury in the middle of the cross-examination and say the government has agreed that they use sleep deprivation. The government agrees that they use the birds. And through going back and forth with these stipulations, I think the jury got the idea that there was coercion and torture here, despite the fact that they were working together to cover this up. The U.S. Attorney had made 10 trips to the Middle East in preparation for this case. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were expended to prosecute this man. On the eve of the trial, they dropped the material support count because they knew that the informant was totally unreliable. There was even reports by the FBI saying, we can't trust this man, how can we use him? But they waited to the eve of the trial, and then what they had was the RICO charge saying Hamas was a racketeering organization, and we put on experts to show that Hamas was a mass organization made up of many different people, that they were the elected government of Gaza in 2006, and all these things about Hamas's charter, and they wanted to drive, they were anti-Jewish. We exposed all that as stuff that wasn't necessarily true. There was a lot of different elements to Hamas. But the other charge that Mohammed Salah was made against Mohammed Salah was lying in an interrogatory in a civil case brought by the Israeli lobby for damages against all these Palestinian organizations and Mohammed Salah for funding Hamas, and then saying they were responsible for a young man that was killed, who they claim was by a Hamas militant. And they're saying since they gave money to Hamas for charity, that whatever Hamas did, they're financially responsible. This is like a unique landmark case brought by Zionist lawyers funded by the ADL after these lawyers were pressuring the U.S. government to indict Mohammed Salah, and they were refusing to do this before 9/11. And that's when they brought this suit. And this suit was a way to first time launder that coerced confession, and to show the U.S. attorney that, wow, you can do this, you can bring this case. And at the end of the day, Mohammed Salah was convicted of that one minor charge, which is, in my experience, 40 years, I've never seen anyone indicted for not telling the truth in an interrogatory answer in a civil case. It's unheard of. And that was, they brought in the Jewish Zionist lawyer to talk about their case to the jury, and it showed how closely the U.S. government was working with the pro-Israel lobby to fashion that charge. And at the end of the day, he was acquitted of the RICO charge, as was his co-defendant, Abdel Halim Ashkar, but he was convicted of that charge, and the government asked for 10 years for that. Said they wanted a terrorism enhancement for that. His co-defendant was convicted of not testifying in front of a grand jury, an act of civil disobedience, a nonviolent act. The government said that was a terrorist act because the grand jury was investigating terrorism, and they asked for 15 years for that act. And the judge gave him 11 years, Dr. Ashkar. And Mohammed Salah got off easy, only 21 months in prison. Still on the list, did his time, came home, and he was still on that terrorist list. He still couldn't get a job. He couldn't buy groceries. He couldn't do anything. And finally, we said, we're going to sue him. We don't care. It's enough. And we filed a lawsuit last year, and they capitulated and finally took him off the list. So it shows you not only Mohammed Salah, but in Holy Land people, Samuel Arian, they have used U.S. terrorism law and these accusations of terrorism, particularly in this instance against Palestinians living in the U.S.